This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, and welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Lhotka. Today in studio, we will have several guests with us from the Forest Health Research and Education Center. But now we have two in studio right now, Dr. Ellen Crocker, who is the Education and Outreach Team Lead, and Dana Nelson, he's the co-director of the center. Dana is also a Forest Service employee working in partnership with UK. So it's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
Good. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming. So before we get started, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in forestry.
I'll go first. This is Dana. I was interested from a pretty young kid with natural things and being outdoors a lot. I think my mother was probably a key reason that I got into forestry per se, because of her basic love of nature and spending a lot of time outdoors with myself and my brothers and sisters. So that kind of got me started. Got into college and decided I would take a look at forestry, and ended up at Iowa State University and got a forestry degree. And while there, forest biology research really piqued my interest. Genetics in particular was something that I felt really interested in, and so I went on to graduate school and studied genetics and became a researcher in that process, and eventually that led me to here.
Okay, good. And Ellen, we've had you on before, but kind of give us a little bit about what you do.
I am an assistant professor here in the forestry department, and the position is Forest Health Extension. So talking with people about trees and forests, how to make them healthy or keep them healthy. And I think it really connects to the work that the Forest Health Research and Education Center is doing. So working with lots of different people on this, from researchers here in the center, to landowners, to professionals, to youth, all sorts of different groups of people about trees and their health.
And what got you interested in forestry?
Well, I've always loved being outside and, the natural world. I think when I graduated undergraduate, I knew I liked being outside, and I just wanted to do some job where I got to be outside all day, every day. And I kind of stumbled into a position at UC Berkeley doing forest pathology. So looking at an invasive disease that was wiping out trees there. It was kind of my first exposure to plant pathology, forestry, forest health, all of that, and I really loved it. So that's what made me want to get a PhD. So I got a PhD in plant pathology, and really interested in forests and their well-being.
Good. No, thanks. And so, Dana, you mentioned that you are also working with the Forest Service, as a service employee. Tell us what you do there.
Yeah, so with the Forest Service, this is U.S. Forest Service. It's part of the USDA, Department of Agriculture. Within the Forest Service, we have the Research and Development branch of the agency, of which I work for, and in particular, I'm with the Southern Research Station. So we have various research stations scattered about the country, based on regional emphasis. And being in the Southern Station, that allowed me to work in Kentucky, as far north as Kentucky. Previously, spent most of my career with the Southern Station in South Mississippi. There, I worked in genetics research, primarily with southern pine trees. While there, more and more of that work that I was involved in dealt with disease and insect resistance in pines. And that kind of led to looking more wider at disease and insect resistance in other tree species, specifically trees of the eastern U.S. And so American chestnut, eastern hemlock, some of the ash species became of more interest to me because of some of the pest and pathogen problems that those trees were having. And that's kind of led into this partnership now that we have here at the University of Kentucky that is the Forest Health Center.
Okay, and can you tell us about how that center is set up and what it does?
Sure, yep. So we view it as a partnership between the Southern Station with the Forest Service and the University of Kentucky. The agreement is with the College of Agriculture, Food, and the Environment, of which the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources is a part of. And so we just have an agreement that we're going to kind of pool our resources, working together to try to advance forest health. And our specific approach to that relates to biological sciences research as well as social sciences research around forest health, and coupling that with the education outreach program that Dr. Crocker mentioned earlier. And so we're focused on looking at forest health, studying the biological aspects of this. In particular, we focus on genetics of resistance in trees to pests and pathogens, and trying to develop a better understanding for how trees resist that and how we can improve trees so that they are able to maintain their health in the forest system. And a lot of this work is done in the context of forestry, which is largely how people and forests interact. So we feel it's really important to have a social science research part of this, and of course coupled with the education outreach. So the three areas kind of come together to form the center.
I think that's something that's pretty special about our Forest Health Research and Education Center, that you do have these kind of three different areas. Frequently, they're kind of studied independently, maybe the genetics of trees and they're resistant to different insects and diseases, the economics of trees, and then actually education and outreach with some of the key stakeholder groups. A lot of times they're kind of each done independently, and I think it's really nice that this center brings all of those together and really thinks about things more holistically.
Could you tell us what's some of the specific projects that you all are working on at the Forest Health Center?
So later today, you're going to be hearing from our biological sciences team lead, Dr. Albert Abbott, as well as our social sciences team lead, about the work that they're doing and their different projects. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of different exciting projects that are ongoing right now. Do you want to mention any of them?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Most of my work is on the biological sciences side, and I don't want to take too much thunder for Dr. Abbott, who will be speaking later as the team leader of that group. But we've been working on American chestnut, particularly looking at disease resistance to chestnut blight and Phytophthora root rot. These two diseases have sort of teamed up to decimate the American chestnut over really 100 years. So starting in the early 1900s, these diseases showed up in North America and started killing American chestnut trees. Earlier work that I was involved in estimated that 4 billion American chestnuts were killed over a period of about 50 years. During and since that time, several research groups have been involved in trying to figure out a way to breed or engineer resistance into American chestnut. And our research team here at the Forest Health Center has been closely involved with much of that research. And this would include sequencing the Chinese chestnut genome, which is the species that has resistance to the blight and Phytophthora root rot, and looking into that sequence, particularly for the specific genes that provide resistance. Knowing what those genes are will help and does help the breeding programs move the resistance from Chinese chestnut into American chestnut, as well as the engineering programs directly transfer resistance genes from Chinese chestnut into American chestnut lines that can then be crossed with other American chestnuts to produce resistant populations. So all that work is, very exciting. It's been a long time in development, and the effort is coming to fruition now as we're, hopeful that resistance can be produced that will be adequate to allow that species to be restored. So that's just one kind of example of an area where we've really focused a lot of biological sciences research, and that I think is important. And I'll let Dr. Abbott speak to some of the other areas a little bit later.
I can can also comment on some of our education and outreach team projects. A couple of the things that I've been involved with, lots of different ways that you can engage non-professional scientists in what we're doing. So sharing the work of our scientific teams, but also trying to increase citizen science and members of the public playing an active role in the research that we're doing, trying to restore some of these tree species. So working with some partners at University of Tennessee, we created the Tree Snap Citizen Science app to try to connect those restoration tree breeding programs that are trying to help the same tree species that were mentioned earlier, American chestnut, ash, hemlock, bring those back. So trying to find a way for just anybody to help contribute to some of those science projects. And then another app that we're just working on right now is an app for woodland owners to help them kind of walk through their woods and assess what's healthy and what's not, and get help with that going forward. So just improving forest health, and that's going to be across the eastern United States. So it's a lot of different exciting projects kind of all across the range of our different biological sciences, social sciences, education, and outreach. One of the projects I was just thinking of that might be kind of a good illustration of how we're all working together on these different things is a project looking at what are the major threats to oak in the eastern United States. So we want to know about that from the biological sciences perspective to know kind of what to prepare for. Oak is a really, really critical group of trees economically, ecologically, for many reasons. So what's out there that could threaten those species? And then from a social sciences perspective, that's really important to know economically, because having better estimates of that can help us justify what we're doing, where we're prioritizing our efforts. And for me in education outreach, knowing what the threats are, getting them on people's radar, helping people better prepare for that. So we work together as a big group to survey experts in everything oak all across the United States and see what they thought were the biggest threats to oak, doing a Delphi survey process, and I think bring some interesting insight into what are the current threats and then what's on the horizon in the future. So another important role that the Forest Health Center plays is increasing communication, facilitating dialogue about some of these forest health issues. So we have an annual Forest Health Center meeting that brings together researchers and different stakeholders all across the board to talk about these things.
All right, well, thank you both for coming in today. And Dr. Nelson, thank you for coming in. And I know, Ellen, you're going to stick around for our next speaker,
Yep.
but we appreciate you, Dr. Nelson, coming in today.
Very good. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. And so up next, we'll have Dr. Bert Abbott, and he's the Biological Sciences Team Leader. He's joining us on the phone. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much.
And so tell us, before we get into the biological sciences part of the health center, can you tell us a little bit about what you do now and what got you interested in forest genetics?
I actually spent a large proportion of my research career working in fruit tree genetics. I worked on many of the tree species that put fruit on the table for America. So I worked on peaches and plums and cherries and a whole number of different fruiting trees. And during that period, I was at Clemson University as a professor in genetics and biochemistry. And during my stay there, we became interested in moving some of our research into the area of forest trees as well, in particular, focusing on chestnut, because chestnut is actually a nut-producing tree, and it's a food crop as well, or was a food crop, and is a food crop in some parts of the world. So it was logical for my work to progress a little bit into the forestry species that were nut-producing species, and then as I got quite interested in and moved further the work that we were doing in understanding the genetics of the traits that are important for fruit and nut crops, I got in connection with Dana and the people that were setting up the Forest Health Center, and they asked me if I would be willing to consult and advise them and help them to shape the biological sciences research that was the focal part of the center's, one of the three tiers of the center's interest. So sort of formulated that idea, and I moved a lot of what I was doing in my laboratory up to the University of Kentucky. So that's sort of where I came from a little bit. And what we're doing now is working on a number of projects that bridge what a lot of the knowledge that we gained working in fruit trees. And now we're transferring that knowledge to forest trees as well. And really the reason that we can do that is because basically fruit trees and forest trees are trees, and they have a lot of similarities. And in fact, most of the fruit trees were wild tree species at one point that were just domesticated. And so there's a lot of genetics overlap between them. And so we leverage information that we learn about traits and the genes that control traits such as the shape of the tree, the height of the tree, the size of the tree, the size of the fruit, any number of traits that were of importance to the fruit tree breeding folks turn out to be important traits for forests as well. So really, it was a natural transition to move from working predominantly on fruit trees to forest trees. And a lot of the work we're doing now is focused on the sort of pathogens and pests and invasive problems that are killing the trees. And we're bringing some perspective on resistance genes, the natural resistance genes that exist within tree species, and how we can essentially select for trees that have improved resistance to pathogens, pests, diseases, and things of that nature. And of course, also that grow well and do well in the environment. And those are things that will be important for reforestation efforts as we move to the future. So that's a little bit about me.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is the time when normally you'd be listening to wildlife sounds of the forest with Dr. Matt Springer. But this week, we're giving Matt a break, and myself, Jonathan Larson, and Hannah Hollowell will be coming to you with insect sounds from the forest. There are lots of different animals out there, and yes, they make interesting sounds, but did you know there are over 1 million different insect species in the world? And that's only the species that we know about. So for these episodes, you'll be learning a little bit about the amazing insect diversity around us. What are those insects that make those weird sounds? What are they doing, and how do they make those noises? We're going to listen to the sound of one insect today. See if you can guess what it is. Stay tuned for the end of the show when we'll talk more about this insect, what it is, and why it's making this noise.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the projects that you all are working on the biological sciences team?
When I transitioned over into working more with the forest trees, in particular with the folks in the U.S. Forest Service, chestnut was one of the main trees in which there was a lot of interest and a lot of genetics work already going on, and some breeding, because the American Chestnut Foundation was trying to breed for resistant materials to put back in the forest. And when we started at the Forest Health Center to develop our biological research team, I felt that it was very important for us to take a very proactive stand against developing it, for us to develop a system that could be used to meet the challenges of all of the different kinds of invasive pathogens that we're experiencing in our forests. And so we focused a lot of our efforts at trying to understand the genetics and look for genetics of resistance to specific problems that are right in front of us today, such as chestnut blight, which has been studied for a number of years. And also in chestnut, there's another disease that's caused by an oomycete pathogen, Phytophthora cinnamomi, and that's called ink disease or root rot disease. And that's actually decimated most of the chestnuts, the American chestnuts in the southeastern part of the U.S. So there's some very key types of diseases which represent a range of different species that attack lots of different plants. For example, Phytophthora cinnamomi, the root rot pathogen, actually will attack over, I think, 3,000 or so different plant species and over many of the different plant families. So these pathogens and that we're looking for resistance to, they're not just important for chestnut, but they're important for a lot of other species of plants as well. So we decided to establish our biological research efforts to focus on understanding the underlying genetics of resistance that exists in nature, and to then leverage that information to find ways to improve and breed for or develop materials that could resist the pathogens that could be used in restoration efforts or in plantings in conservation. So those are a couple of things. We work on these fungal diseases, and we work on an oomycete disease. And we're really interested in the genetics of resistance and leveraging genetics approaches to breed for improved materials. We're also working on not just fungal pathogens, but we're also working on starting a big project on resistance to emerald ash borer, which is an insect pathogen. Pest that's decimating and will decimate virtually all the ash trees in the eastern part of the United States before it's finished. We have been working closely with the colleagues in entomology, Lynn Risky-Kinney's group, to develop some strategies to try to eliminate the pest. And some of those are actually have been shown by Lynn Risky-Kinney's group to be very successful at this point. And so we're moving that project forward to see if we can get some trees that themselves are significantly resistant to the pathogen. So that's a project that we have a lot of interest in. And we are also doing a lot of work in, as I said, sort of, we're trying to be prepared for things that might happen. And so a lot of the work we do is bringing very modern technologies, very modern breeding technologies, breeding strategies, genetics and genomics technologies, biotechnological approaches, being well aware and well equipped through the collaborations we do in the country and worldwide, being well equipped to, if a problem arises, to approach that problem. And so we're doing work on some species where we may not have a major problem right now, but we see that those species are underpinning a lot of the state, then the state and the country's rural economies, such as white oak as an example. And we have initiated projects to understand the genetics and the diversity of white oak, and we're hoping to be able to prepare ourselves if there's a problem in some of these other major tree species in our forests, to be able to bring technology to bear very quickly to try to eliminate the problem, or to at least, if it's a pathogen or a pest that's basically destroying our forest, to be able to obtain or improve materials that could go back in the forest for reforestation efforts. So we really take an active, proactive approach to the science and the biology. We really want to understand what makes a tree, and we want to understand what are the things that control those resistance genes and those genes that are important for sustaining those trees in the environment. So there's a few things that we do. I could probably name a few others.
No, that's fine.
That's great. And we've talked about this before, but maybe just for some of our new listeners that might just be joining us, can you tell them a little bit about why it's important to care about this? What's the importance, kind of from the biological side, to have healthy trees and to have these species survive and make sure that, they're not being destroyed by some of these pests and pathogens and things like that?
In many times in presentations that I've given and in seminars around the country and the world, I've always made the case that if you look around you at all of the things that impact your life directly, you will find that most of it is relying, or in one way or another, related to trees. And I often show lots of pictures of different things that are in our lives, and most all of them are wood derived. Trees provide food for us and for wildlife and for other animals. So really, I've always said that I work on the most important species to humankind. And that is, and as in my mind, and I think it's a pretty easy argument, convincing argument, that trees are probably the most important kinds of species that humans rely on. And so that for that reason, we need to understand them. We need to understand how they grow, what challenges they face, and we need to understand their biology so that we can actually design and develop ways to preserve them and preserve our forests, keep our forests healthy, because basically our existence relies on the trees and the presence of trees. So that's really what it's all about for me, and to understand what's important in how they develop and how they respond to the environment. These are all really important issues that we need to understand a lot. And we, in the past, have not basically focused enough on this. I could argue that most of the research investment that's been made in this country for sure has been in commodity crops. But on the other hand, trees represent probably the most important organism that probably sustain us. And in the future, I would hope we begin to invest a lot more in developing a better understanding of what makes a tree and how it survives, and how we can better help it in the health of its health, so that we do have important forestry resources that sustain us and the world that we live in.
Up next, we'll have Dr. Thomas Achudo, and thank you so much for coming, joining us via phone today. We really appreciate it.
Well, joining us right now, we've got Dr. Thomas Achudo. He is the Assistant Professor of Forest Economics here in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and he's also the head of the Social Sciences team for the Forest Health Center. So we talked a little bit about the Biological Sciences team and what they're working on, but I'd love to hear from you a little bit more on what do we mean by social sciences, and how does that relate to forest health?
So first of all, everybody's kind of very familiar with biological processes as relates to forestry, from a number of subfields in forestry: silviculture, genetics, physiology. However, the human dimension component is also another key segment of forestry as a field. In the history of forestry, the social dimension was kind of taken for granted until in the 1980s, when people realized that despite all the good science, quote unquote, forestry management was not really achieving some of the desired benefits or objectives. And forest managers realized that there is this segment of dealing with the people that was not really given due attention, and that was actually the birth of social forestry. So in our sub-team of socio-economics, we're dealing with issues related to dealing with the landowners, issues relating to what are the economic implications of forestry and forest management. It is the people who manage the forest. In Kentucky, majority of the forests are under private ownerships, and these are basically smallholder or family forest owners. So the government or the public as such have limited direct influence in terms of what they should do and what they should not do, particularly those that are based on personal decisions of an individual or of a family. So that is where this sub-team comes in. So we focus on looking at what are the social dynamics as they relate to forestry, and looking at the decisions the forest landowners make and how this affects the overall sustainability of forestry. The economic segment also is very important. In policy decisions, we usually use economic as an indicator, or economic impacts as an indicator of what we desire or what we don't desire. So sustainability has the three pillars of environmental or the science segment, the social, and then we have the economic. So in our team, we're dealing with actually those two pillars combined, the social and then the economic.
I think you bring up a really good point that you can have the best science in the world, but if no one's implementing it on the ground, if those social and economic incentives aren't there, then it doesn't go anywhere.
Exactly. So I usually tell my students that the science of forest management is the easy part. Because we know what happens, we can predict what happens if we do particular silvicultural treatment on a tree or on a forest or a forest stand. We know how it is going, the forest is going to respond. But dealing with the people, the social segment is very complex.
People are unpredictable, huh?
People are unpredictable, one, but people are also capable of going against what is good for them.
Mm-hmm.
It is not that if going with option A is giving you the highest economic returns, everybody is going to go for that. So there are other non-economic factors that come into play when it comes to individual decisions in how they manage their resources. And those are the issues that we try to investigate and engage in. And when we talk of forest health, it's not directly linked to pests and diseases, but the overall sustainability of the forest, the integrity of the forest as a whole. So we have been doing some work on ecosystem services here in Kentucky. So ecosystem services are just those benefits that we get from nature. So we call them non-market benefits, such as soil erosion control, climate regulation, among many others, pollination. So if we, for instance, we cut our trees and leave the land bare, we are basically destroying the habitat for the pollinator bees, and that consequently will affect pollination of our crops or fruit crops. And that, at the end of the day, is going to affect the overall sustainability that we are very much interested in.
Good point. Are there any projects that you're working on right now that you'd like to tell people about?
Yes, there is also the issue on the white oak. So we all know here in Kentucky that Kentucky is the leading state in bourbon production in the country, and most probably in the world, if I'm not wrong. So the bourbon production depends on white oak for production of the barrels that are used in distilleries. So the data that we have from the FIA, Forest Inventory Analysis, show that there is poor recruitment of white oak. So we have more on the older diameter classes and less on the lower diameter classes. So more mature trees compared to recruitment. So that is a dangerous population. A healthy population is a pyramid with a larger base and a smaller tip. So the young ones grow up to replace the old ones. But the white oak population is almost inverted pyramid. So we have large numbers at the top and fewer at the bottom. So if you look at that in the long term, that projects some problems, because once all the older trees are harvested, we may not have, or we are going to have less and less to harvest in the future. And of course, white oak is a long rotation crop, 60, 80, 100 years. So we have to start doing something now to address the long-term sustainability, and that relates back to forest health. So we are looking at what are the problems why we have this situation of poor recruitment, and we will be distilling out some projected economic impacts into the future under various scenarios, if we do something or if we don't, so that we can bring this information out clearly to the industry, that is the distiller industry, to the forest managers, the state level and also at the federal level, but also to the landowners.
Well, that sounds really interesting and also important for the long-term sustainability of our forests and the economies that depend on them. So thanks so much for talking with us today about the work that you're doing. And I think you really illustrated how the social sciences aspect is essential for us seeing both the environmental and also the economic impacts that we want to be seeing as a center.
Thank you. You're welcome.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So now in studio we have Dr. Tyler Dredden, and he is a Forest Service employee as well as an adjunct member of the University of Kentucky. So thank you for coming in today to talk about your role with the Forest Health Center.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us what you do kind of with that role as a Forest Service employee and as an adjunct member of UK.
Okay, so I'm a research plant pathologist with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station, but I'm based here at the University of Kentucky in the Plant Sciences building.
Okay. What got you started in plant pathology?
Okay, so my bachelor's degree is in forest management. One of the last classes was a forest health class, and I really enjoyed the professor and the course, and decided to pursue a master's degree in forest pathology. Yeah, I haven't decided to leave that yet.
Okay, that's good.
Tell us what a day in a life of a plant pathologist would look like. What are you doing?
So it varies wildly, but me personally, so I work mostly on fungal tree diseases. So a lot of what I've done in the past is trying to diagnose issues going on with the trees and working on emerging diseases.
What are some of the tree species you're focused in on?
So a lot of my work has been with laurel wilt disease. It's in the southeastern U.S., but it's spreading rapidly. So dealing with a lot of red bay, swamp bay, and some avocado.
Okay.
Avocado.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in this area, sassafras, right?
Yes.
So do we have avocado trees here?
Oh, I wish. I love some. Well, we have sassafras, and it might not be, what people think of as like a big timber species or something like that. But it's a beautiful tree for around your house because it has great fall foliage. But it's also really important in forests as well, right?
It has a very unique of root beer. That's
Root beer.
how they used to make root beer.
With sassafras
Sarsaparilla,
trees.
right?
Oh, well, yeah, that would make sense. That would make sense.
So, Tyler, I know you've got a paper out looking at the population biology of laurel wilt and that pathogen you were talking about, as well as its vector, right? So that's a really important part of this disease, too. It's not just the fungus, but a little bit more, right?
Yeah, so laurel wilt's a kind of interesting disease because it's caused by the pathogen, a fungal pathogen, Rafflesia loricola, but the pathogen is vectored by the red bay ambrosia beetle. So the way it works here in the southeast is the red bay ambrosia beetle is attracted to healthy trees, and it bores into the trees, and then inoculates the pathogen. And then the pathogen actually moves throughout the tree, blocking the vascular tissue and causing the tree to wilt. And then in this system, the ambrosia beetle bores into the dead tree and makes galleries where it actually raises the pathogen Raffaello luricula in these fungal gardens. And these fungal gardens are the sole food source for the ambrosia beetle and her gallery of offspring.
Oh, okay. So we've been talking about several different pathogens and viruses and bugs and all this that are killing these trees. So if you have one pathogen or bug that is like, say, ash trees, is it going to go to, say, an oak tree later if all of these die out? Because I know he had mentioned earlier, they had said that we've lost billions of chestnut oaks. So is it just hop to something else?
So it all depends on what you're talking about.
Okay.
In the case of laurel wilt, for just an example, it affects members of the Lauraceae plant family. So like I said, some examples were red bay, swamp bay, sassafras, and avocado. And this disease or pathosystem is specific to that plant family. And some members of the family are more or less susceptible than others. But other diseases, other pests can have a very wide host range. So it all depends.
Okay.
So in this case, the host trees and the beetle and the pathogen all co-evolved in Asia.
Okay.
And since they co-evolved, it's not that big of a deal. At least in Asia, ambrosia beetles, like most ambrosia beetles, go to dead and dying trees, where it then inoculates the fungus, and then grows it and eats it and reproduces. And it's specific to that family of trees in Asia. But since it only goes to dead and dying trees, it's not really a problem. The issue is here in the U.S., something is a little off, and the ambrosia beetle is attracted to perfectly healthy trees and inoculates the fungus, and then the fungus kills the trees in a matter of weeks. So it's just a completely different system here, because our Lauraceae hosts are not co-evolved with the beetle and the pathogen.
I think a lot of times when people hear about epidemiology or this kind of thing, they're thinking of human health and CSI or something like
Right.
that. But you kind of do that in the plant world too. So some of your work has been trying to understand, how did we get this pathogen? Where did it come from? And to kind of help us better stop it from becoming an even bigger problem in the future, right?
Yeah, so we did a population genetic study on the laurel wilt system. So a little bit of background. The beetle was first detected in 2002 near Savannah, Georgia. And since then, the beetle and the disease has spread throughout the southeast. But there's been several disjunct jumps in the distribution of the disease. So one of the aims of our population genetic study was to see what's the diversity of the vector and the pathogen here in the U.S., and how many introductions to the U.S. has there been. So was there one initial introduction with one genotype that's then spread throughout the U.S., and it's been people moving that same previously introduced genotypes using infested material throughout to get these disjunct populations, or those new introductions from Asia? And the results were we have very limited diversity in the U.S. for both the vector and the pathogen. So it appears that there was a single introduction into the U.S. from Asia. And we did also find the same genotype present in the U.S. was also found in Taiwan. So Taiwan is our best hypothesis for the source of the U.S. introduction.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that really highlights the role that we play in moving around some of these problems too.
Definitely, because other researchers are trying to identify tolerance or resistance in the native populations of the forest trees. So they'll go to sites that have just been devastated by laurel wilt, where there's over 99% mortality, and try and find the lone surviving individuals and then screen them for resistance. So they can use our research, where we found there was very limited diversity in the pathogen, to help inform their screening methods. So they can use a limited number of isolates to screen for resistance. But that does highlight the need to limit future introductions of other genotypes, because different genotypes of the vector or the pathogen could overcome the resistance that researchers are trying to identify.
How is it moving around from place to place?
So it's hypothesized that the original introduction into the U.S. was in solid wood packing material. So untreated crating surrounding whatever they're shipping over to the U.S.
Okay.
And then in the U.S., the ambrosia beetles can fly, so they can spread very well by themselves.
Okay.
We also move it in infested wood material, and firewood is one example of an easy way to move the pest and pathogen.
So don't move firewood. And I think that's pretty consistent in that moving firewood is a great way to introduce all sorts of terrible things. Invasive insects really that's kind of a key way in which emerald ash borer was moved around, and which other ones were as well. So, not moving firewood is really important from the perspective of limiting those invasive species and the damage that they do. And if you want to learn more about some of that, you can check out a few different websites. One of them to check out is one called Unlucky for Kentucky. That's from the Office of the State Entomologist, that profiles some of the different invasive insects that are potentially harming our trees, how to identify them, and prevent getting them.
But it's not just firewood. It's more broadly moving infested wood products. So there was one example of a wood turner went to North Florida where laurel whelk was present and saw these dead red bay. And in the case of laurel whelk, you get this really pretty kind of a bluish purple black staining in the vascular system of these trees. And this wood turner saw this and he was like, this would make awesome bolts. So he cut down bolts, took it to South Florida, and a few months later, all the red bay trees in his yard died. And he saw all the exit holes from his beautiful turning blanks. So it's not just firewood. It's moving infested wood products.
And I know that you mentioned earlier kind of the day in the life of a plant pathologist. So for those students that might be listening, do you hire or have undergraduate or graduate researchers at all that can help get involved on research that you're working on?
So we have in the past.
And what type of research would they get involved, or could they get involved with that?
It could be pretty wide-ranging. So our lab has worked on quite a few different disease systems.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to get skills that will let you do molecular biology, whether it's human or plant, it'd be a lot of the same skill set. So if you're interested in that kind of lab work, this could be a good opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
The students will get, they'll be able to do some field work. They'll get to have some practice doing some sterile culture work, and then some molecular biology. So it'll be a good experience for the right students.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Insect Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Ellen Crocker in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. Before we tell you what that is, let's listen to that sound once more.
Okay, that sounds like a frog. I know that can't be a frog. We're insect sounds from the forest.
Well, frogs eat insects,
Right.
so maybe that's the connection, right?
Belly.
Yeah, it's out of its stomach. So, despite what it sounded like, that's actually the northern mole cricket. So not a frog, not a mole, but a cricket that maybe sounds like a frog.
He's an imposter on two ends.
And if you think that the sound was weird, Google mole cricket and see what kind of images you get. Because I think they look like a cross between an insect and a vole. Like something that would dig deep into the ground.
I had a client once bring me one, and they said it looks like something that crawled through nuclear waste. Yeah, so they do have an odd appearance.
But very well adapted to what it is they do, right? So with a name like mole cricket, you can probably take some guesses at that.
Yeah, they dig beneath the ground to form their tunnels. The males dig out a lot of the tunnels and then will try to attract the females to wherever their tunnels are. Some stuff that I've read, it sounds like the females, even though it's like reverberating underneath the ground, are still able to hone in on exactly where the males are, which I think is really neat.
It's romantic.
Yeah.
So he builds a home for her, right?
Yeah, very nice.
Do they live in these tunnels?
Yeah, they are a subterranean species. They can be a pest sometimes. They uproot turf grass, and when they're feeding below ground, they can harm some plants, but generally it's more of a curiosity. The further south you go, the more golf courses and lawn care operators hate them, but around here it's sort of just a, what is that? That's weird kind of thing.
When they're not messing up your lawn, you might
Right.
find them by kind of wetter areas,
Yeah.
streams,
Yep.
ponds, that kind of
They
habitat.
need easy to dig through ground, so
Yeah.
anywhere that's kind of damp, I would say. They have really weird feet in the front. They're analogous to a mole's claws or a vole's claws. They're kind of built so that they can scrape soil out of their way. Looks a lot like a bulldozer, and they're really, really talented at doing that. And they do build these weird tunnels where they sing from this little amphitheater that they create for mating. The northern one is interesting because it sort of seals it off so that maybe they don't get eaten as much. There are some wasps that hunt them and want to lay their eggs in them. So it seems to be a protective barrier, but the female is still able to locate him and find the sound and get in there and do the mating.
So do they fly around at any point in their life, or are they entirely underground?
I think these are below ground, yeah.
Living entirely underground. How do crickets make their sounds?
Crickets are one of our stridulators. It's kind of that violin appearance. They rub one thing on another thing. So for some, it's rubbing wings together. For others, it's rubbing a leg on a wing. It has to be a file and a scraper. There are two adaptations on the opposing appendages, I guess you can say, that are adapted to make that noise.
I've read that the mole cricket has the lowest pitched sound of all of the crickets.
So
Very
of the three
deep
of us,
singer.
yeah, that would be the mole cricket.
You said they laid eggs. How many eggs do they lay? How many crickets can they have?
Cricket egg case is going to probably be anywhere between 50 and 100, I would say.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Do all of those survive?
No.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
insects, that's one of the ways that they're successful is they overmake the eggs. And hopefully there's so many that one of them at least gets to adulthood to pass on the genes to the next generation.
Do they eat each other? Like
There
some
can be-
insects do?
There can be some cannibalism, even with crickets, particularly with the field crickets. I've seen field crickets eat each other a lot. I think orthopterans, this group that mole crickets and field crickets are in, I always say they're kind of like the Hills Have Eyes people, that movie with the cannibals in the mountains. They're just like, they're horrifying little eating machines. And I had a wolf spider I kept as a pet once, and I put a field cricket in there, and the next day I came back to a full field cricket and no wolf spider. It ate the spider. So they're tough little critters. I mean, it's not unfair to say that they will just attack anything and try and eat it. They're omnivorous.
Well, thank you for making us terrified of crickets.
Not something I thought I had to worry about was crickets.
They can't get you.
Yet. Well, thank you both so much for coming and talking with us about mole crickets.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.